I will turn on my microphone. I'm sorry, everybody. Turn on my microphone for those of you on the live stream. Let me just kind of recap really quick. Sorry, Zoomers, you're going to have to hear this again. But we have brand new ABF notes on our website, fbchh.org. If you go to the resource tab and go about halfway down, you'll see ABF notes. If you click on ABF notes, you should be able to click on that, and then you'll see there's 4 pages. 2 pages are blanks that have blanks that we'll go through, and then 2 pages will be like exercises we're going to work through. And that should cover this Sunday and next Sunday, and then in May we'll start a brand new series. So just to recap where we've been really quick the last few weeks, we have been working through basically indirect ways that people can, that storytellers can get their point across, right? So we've been talking about foreshadowing, which is not out there in the open. You have to kind of do a little bit of work to think that through. And a lot of different ways, using names to foreshadow, using characters to foreshadow, using type scenes we've been talking about the last few weeks. And all that stuff is fun and entertaining, and depending on how deep you like to go, you find that fascinating, or if you really are struggling with some of the indirect stuff, it can almost be irritating that you have to look at it so closely. Today what I want to do is I want to wrap up this whole long discussion of looking at biblical stories by examining a direct way that the storyteller likes to let us know what he is thinking as he's doing this. And it's something that's called using editorial comments, okay? Editorial comments. Now, an editorial comment, as simply as I can explain it, is basically where you have somebody who is telling a story and they're relating the events of the story, and then in the middle or at the end or somewhere in the story, the characters are not giving their opinion, but the editor himself, the storyteller himself, inserts his own 2 cents on what's happening. And the storyteller almost acts as like having this vantage point that's outside the story to kind of help us understand what's going on in the story. And they call them editorial comments. And the Old Testament especially is filled to the rafters with these editorial comments because the storytellers want to make sure you get the point. Sometimes they'll use indirect methods to do it, and if you get it, you get it, and if you don't, you can come back and read it a second time later, and maybe you'll pick it up then. But some points are so important for them to make that they want to make sure that you don't miss it. And so they throw these statements in there, and those statements are designed to kind of point you towards the true north and get the sense of what they're talking about. So what I want to do to start with is I want to give you a couple of kind of overarching statements about what these are and how they work and how to look for them in the text. And then we're going to dive into several different examples in the biblical text where you can see this in operation, and so you can sort of get an example of how I would look for these in an actual story, where they tend to pop up and stuff like that. Okay? So let's talk about editorial comments. So if you look on page 1 of the notes that are on fbchh.org, you'll notice here page 1 starts off with one last thing to look for. And all of you who are looking forward to a new study can go amen. It's almost over. Here it is. Occasionally, biblical storytellers have a direct way, that's the first blank, a direct way to get their point across to their readers. And for those of you that like the direct approach, this is going to be much more fun for you than the last few weeks have been. And what way is that? What is the direct way? It's by making editorial comments. That's what go in the next 2 blanks, editorial comments. Now, let me just talk to you about where these comments usually show up. So if you're reading a story and you're looking for an editorial comment, where should you look? The first place I recommend that you look is the end of the story, okay? These comments, and this is the first sub-point under this one here, these comments often come at the end of the narrative. It's almost like the storyteller wants to tell you what happened first, and he wants to show you the vantage point of the people who are actually in the story. And then at the end, he wants to kind of wrap it all up with his own personal understanding or his own personal interpretation of it so that you can kind of grapple with his perspective on the story, okay? Now, sometimes it's not at the end of the story, but it is, and this is the next blank here, at a transitional point in the narrative. So the story can be going along, and it's just telling us what happened to the people in the story. And then there's a major transition in the story, like a turning point, or like a big twist in the story that you're not expecting. And at the twist, he'll throw his 2 cents in so that you can understand what he thinks about it. And then he will move along to the rest of the story, okay? So it's either at the end of the story to sort of wrap it up, or it's at a transitional point in the story so that he can then help you to understand how to finish out and understand at the end. All right, so 2 Samuel 11:27 is going to be an example of a transitional point, okay? And then Genesis 25, Genesis 13, and some of these other ones are going to be at the end of the narrative. So I'll try to show you that when we get there. So it's check at the end of a narrative or check out a transitional point in the narrative. Okay, second thing after this. These comments, these editorial comments, reveal either the storyteller's perspective, that's the first blank, or God's perspective, okay? Storyteller's perspective or God's perspective. Now, if you believe, like I do, that God is the one who is inspiring the words that are being said and written down by the storytellers, there almost is no difference between the storyteller and between God. But sometimes the storyteller will insert something so that you can understand where God is coming from in this story. Like, what does God think, right? Because, and we'll talk about this later, but anytime you're reading a story and you see people doing things in the story, you should never assume that God approves of what is happening. That's just a horrible, horrible assumption. Even if the person doing the thing is like a priest or a prophet or a king or a good guy, right? Like if you're reading it and it's a story about a good guy, you should never assume the good guy is operating under the approval of God for his specific actions. Again, usually he is, or she is, sometimes he or she is, but you can't, it's really bad policy to just assume from the beginning that the good guys are doing the good things that God approves of, right? And so even in the middle of stories about good guys, sometimes we have these little editorial comments that drop in there so that we can figure out what God thinks about what these people are doing. Okay, in fact, this first one from 2 Samuel that we're going to look at is one of those, where the editor, the storyteller's like, let me just take a minute before we go any further in this story to let you know how God feels about what just happened in the story. All right, and we'll get that in just a minute. So either storyteller's perspective or God's perspective on the actions, thoughts, or intentions of the characters in the story. Number 3, the storyteller expects you to trust him. In other words, the storyteller believes he's right about his interpretation of the event. And he expects you as the storyteller, or excuse me, the reader of the story, to trust that he knows what he's talking about and to interpret, that's the second blank, the story, to interpret the story in light of that understanding. In other words, he assumes that you're going to believe that he's telling the truth about what's going on here. Now, you could still argue with the storyteller. And again, if it's just a normal story, just a normal human story, like you're reading The Scarlet Letter or something by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Nathaniel Hawthorne inserts his 2 cents about what the characters are doing and whether or not he thinks it's a good or a bad thing, you could disagree with the author and be like, you know what, Nathaniel Hawthorne, I think you're narrow-minded and you're, antiquated and you have a really dumb perspective on this. I disagree with you. I think the characters are doing the right thing, or whatever. When it comes to Scripture, though, we don't have that freedom. Right? Because as soon as we start arguing with the storyteller, we're arguing with the God who inspired the story in the first place, and so that's where we get into trouble, right? So the storyteller assumes that you're going to trust him, that this is the right way to understand the story. Now, there's a couple of them, and I don't think I have any of them today for you to look at, but there's a couple of interpretations that the storyteller gives of a story that I look at and I go, really? Really? That doesn't seem to make sense to me. And yet, I kind of have to back off at that moment and say, okay, if I don't agree with the storyteller's, interpretation of this event, there must be something in the story that I'm missing. And so I try to be humble enough to go back to the square one and be like, okay, what am I missing in this story that I'm not getting there, that I'm not understanding what's supposed to be happening? You with me so far? Does that make sense? A little bit of sense? Okay, let's keep going. It'll make more sense when we actually start to apply it to actual passages. All right, the fourth point here. Most of the time, the storyteller tells his stories without giving direct evaluations of the goodness or sinfulness of the behaviors of the characters in the story. All right? Most of the time, every time somebody does something, there's not a little parentheses where the storyteller goes, oh, and by the way, they were doing the right thing. Or, oh, and by the way, this was a bad idea. Or, by the way, this was a sinful. Most of the time, they just tell the story, and they sort of are counting on you as the reader to kind of put two and two together and come up with whether it's good or it's bad, right? If they show somebody lying, they expect that you've read the 10 Commandments at some point and that you would know that lying is bad. Other times, the hints that they drop are a little bit more subtle, and that's why I've been bringing up so many of these indirect methods, these hints that the storyteller is dropping into the story on purpose to guide your interpretation, all right? That's usually the way they handle it. Here's the second half of that. It's got a couple more blanks I want you to fill in. He leaves his hints, that's another blank, and he trusts you to connect the dots and follow him to the proper conclusion. All right? Most of the time, he's not going to come right out and say, this is good, this is bad, this is how you should understand the story. They're not going to do the hard work for you most of the time. But sometimes they do, and that comes to this last point here. An editorial comment is used by the storyteller when he doesn't want to take the chance that his readers might misunderstand his point, right? If he's telling a story and he's like, you know what, I can't think of a way to do this in a subtle way. I can't think of an indirect way to do this so they make sure they get it. And this is so important, I want to make sure they get the point that I'm trying to make. So I'm just going to come right out and I'm going to give you my 2 cents. A little word. I hope my deacons aren't listening. Oh, yeah, I got one in the room that's listening to me. A lot of times when I want my deacons to give me their opinions in deacon meetings, and I don't go first sharing my opinion. Now, that's not because the deacons that are serving, are mindless slaves to obey everything that the pastor says. But I'm not foolish enough to think that when the pastor puts his opinion out there, it doesn't have just a little bit more weight than somebody else's opinion. And so usually, like it happened this last week in our deacon meeting, I was like, okay, guys, I've got an opinion, but I don't want to say it first. I want you guys to tell me what you think first, unencumbered by my biases or my prejudices, and then I'll throw my thing in at the end, and if it changes the way you think, fine, but I don't want to change the way you think before you've had a chance to think it through yourself. That is usually the way biblical narratives work. The storyteller doesn't want to spoon feed you every little idea, treating you as if you're a child. The storyteller would just as soon you do the work of thinking it through, understanding what's the point, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, what are the good actions, what are the bad actions, right? Where is this story going? He wants you to do the work because he knows when you're invested, you will learn much, much more. When you're not invested, when you're just getting spoon-fed, when somebody's just telling you what to think, yes, you might obey, you might be more likely to obey or to do what the story wants you to do, but you're less likely to grab onto it and make it a part of your own personal worldview. And that's what story is trying to do. Story is trying to shape the way you see and interpret the world. And so he leaves a lot of the work to do. But occasionally, he can't help himself, just like me. Occasionally, I can't help myself. I've got to let my thoughts be known because it's so important, I don't want anybody to miss maybe the point I'm trying to make. You with me on this so far? All right, let's dive into some actual examples because then I think it's going to become much, much more clear. Open up to 2 Samuel chapter 11. Now, if you guys were a part of this class back when we were all meeting together, I handed out a sheet of paper like probably a month and a half ago that has this text printed on it. So if you're like there and you've got your notebook open, you got like a stack of old papers, if you flip backwards several pages, and I don't even know what page it would be, if you flip back several pages, you'll come to this, and it's the story of David and his sin with Bathsheba, okay? Now, I'm not going to read the whole chapter. We already did that, and I tend to have this bad habit of, like, when I'm just reviewing or referring back to one I've already taught before, I kind of get revved up and I start teaching it all over again just because I love the story so much. I'm going to try not to do that, online people. I'm going to try really hard not to do that and just sort of hit the high points. And then we're going to come to this editorial comment, which is really, really important, and it illustrates everything I've been talking about. Okay, so 2 Samuel chapter 11 is the first one on the board here. 2 Samuel chapter 11, and the editorial comment's not till verse 27. But you remember the story, right? It's the time of year when kings go off to battle with their troops, and David sends the army away, but David stays home. And that's the first sign that something is not right and that something is rotten in the state of Denmark, right? Something is not quite the way it ought to be. Why isn't the king going with his troops? I'm not only just a king, David's never been a bureaucrat, has he? David has been a man of action his whole life. David was almost born with a sword in his hand, right? So why is he sending the army out and staying home? And then we find out he's just lounging around on his rooftop one night, and he sees something he shouldn't have seen, he desires something he shouldn't have desired, and he takes something he shouldn't have taken. Right? And that's Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. And in the process of the whole thing, she lets him know, hey, just want you to know, little change of plans, I'm expecting a baby. David figures, I better try to cover this up because this is not the way it's supposed to be. And so David goes on an elaborate plan to cover his tracks, to make it look like nothing bad happened, nothing to see here, everything is fine. And you see David using his authority, sending. Remember, we talked about this under repetition, repeating key terms. David sends here, does that, sends. He's using his kingly authority to cover his tracks, to cover his mistakes. And by and large, he's pretty successful. Like, he manages to get Bathsheba's husband killed with basically sending him into a part of the battle and then basically retreating all of his men. And so basically he gets whacked, and David comes to the end of it. And things are looking pretty good for David. And then we come to verse 26, okay? You ready? This is where we're going to actually dive into the text. 2 Samuel 11, verse 26. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. Okay? Now, this is another one of the signs, by the way, that Bathsheba gets kind of a bad rap. Because the truth is that Bathsheba shows all the signs that she is not necessarily a full and willing participant to everything that happened. Her husband is killed in battle, and she's not at home throwing a party saying, woohoo, I finally got rid of the old battle axe, right? I finally got rid of the old ball and chain. I'm free to marry whoever I want. She's at home, and she does what any wife would do whose husband has been killed in battle. She enters into a period of intense mourning, lamentation, right? But look at this, verse 27. And when the mourning was over, here's the repetition again. David what? Sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. I mean, this couldn't have worked out any better for David than this. I mean, this is like the perfect way that this could have happened for David, right? He gets to have what he wants. He gets rid of the obstacles. He brings in what he wants. She has the baby. Everything's great. Everybody's happy. And so here's the comment, the question that I have here under 2 Samuel chapter 11. The casual reader, right, who's just reading this casually, might wonder if David, as the king, was entitled to act the way he did in this sordid episode, right? That is what you would wonder. You would wonder is the king allowed to do whatever he wants, right? Doesn't that just make sense? Because that's how kings operate. To this day, that's how politicians operate, right? We kind of get power and then we just sort of do it and we hope that the courts don't overturn it later. That's kind of what politicians do. So maybe the king is just acting perfectly appropriately right here. Maybe he's doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing. And the casual reader would go, I wonder what God thought about all this. Well, the storyteller up till now, if you've been paying attention, you should know how God felt about all this stuff. Why? Because David is breaking commandments left and right, isn't he? Like, he's taking the 10 commandments and he's getting a shredder and he's putting the stone tablets are going through a mega shredder and shredding all the commandments. Coveting, adultery, murder, I mean, like, you name it, bearing false witness, like he's breaking commandments everywhere. So we all should know how God feels about this. But the storyteller doesn't want to take a chance that you might miss it and go, well, maybe he's the king, so there's exceptions and he's allowed. Because look at what he says here in verse 27. That's the part I didn't read to you. But the thing that David had done, what did it do? Displeased the Lord. This, and by the way, that's not the end of the story, right? It's not like God was just upset. Oh, David, you shouldn't have done that. And then God continues with his day, and David continues with his day with his new wife and his new baby, right? No, at that point, we have a transition in the story. And up until this point, David's been doing all the sending. David's been doing all the manipulating. David's been doing all the stuff he wants to do. Then God, the editor goes, the storyteller goes, God was not happy about this. And then starting in verse 1 of chapter 12, what is the first 3 words, or 4 words? And the Lord sent Nathan to David. So David sends like half a dozen times in one chapter. In chapter 12, God goes, I'm going to send one guy, Nathan. And that one sending upends David's entire apple cart. It like takes his lies and it drags him out into the open, and it brings horrible consequences into David's life that last for dozens of years. Not just like in the moment, slap on the wrist, and now you go back to your life as it was. Like, the consequences are severe from here on out for David. Okay? So, all of that to say, this editorial comment is thrown in there at a transitional point in the story to make sure that all of us are on board with the fact that what David did was not right. You with me on that so far? Does that make sense? Now, that's a pretty obvious one. Let me get to one that's a little bit less obvious, and that's from Genesis 25. Okay, the second one on the board here. Genesis 25. Genesis 25. Now, this is really interesting. I love this one because it's very sort of unexpected. We talked about this passage earlier as well when we were talking about the significance of names in foreshadowing. Okay? So there's both indirect stuff in this passage and there's direct stuff as well, because there's an editorial comment that gets thrown in there that we need to grapple with. Now, if you remember this story, this one's short enough. I'm just going to read the whole thing with you, okay? I'm going to read the whole thing, and then I'm going to have you talk to me a little bit about how this is playing out, and then we'll try to get to that editorial comment and see if it makes sense. Okay, so here we go. Verse 29. Verse 29. Yes. Verse 29 says this. Once, when Jacob was cooking stew. Now, pause for a second. What does Jacob's name mean? Do you remember this? His name. What does it mean? Deceiver or conniver or manipulator, right? When he was born, what was significant about what happened when Jacob was born? The actual event. Yes. Esau was born first, right? He's the firstborn. As Esau is being born, what is Jacob doing? He's grabbing at his heel, right? He's grabbing at his ankle. And the idea is, no, I want to go first. I want to go first, right? And it's probably was just one of those funny little things that happens in a miraculous event like a birth that the midwife probably was just like, how about that? That's interesting. And then that sort of becomes a foreshadowing of what kind of a person Jacob is going to be throughout the rest of his life. He's always going to feel like he's second in line, and he always wants to push to the front of the line. That's Yaakov. That's the one who grasps at the heel. That's sort of just his personality. Okay? So that's the indirect thing we were talking about. But let's read this. So he's making stew one day, right? Esau came in from the field because Esau, his personality is wild, hairy hunter man, right? Like that's what he's known as. When he was born, apparently he was hairy. He had red hair from the beginning. He was a hairy kid from the top of his head to the bottom of his foot, apparently. And he was just manly from the womb, right? So he's out in the field. He's hunting or doing whatever he does, whatever the hunter-gatherers do as their knuckles drag on the ground. I'm just joking about that. Whatever the hunters are doing, that's what Esau is doing, right? And then Jacob is at home cooking, right? And you're like, oh, sure, I can see the difference between these two kids right now. Esau comes in, and he was exhausted, the text tells us in verse 29. And Esau said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted. Therefore, his name was called Edom. Edom means red stuff, I guess. Jacob said, sell me your birthright now. Sell me your birthright. What is that an example of? Second place Jacob, wanting to be first place, grabbing at the heel of his brother who's in first place, and pulling to the front. And we all go, that Jacob. There he goes again. Jacob Rowling, I'm not talking about you. Well, that Jacob, he's just trying to get to... Boy, what a sneaky, conniving jerk that Jacob is, right? That's what you're tempted to think when you read this. And I don't blame you for that. That's sort of partly what the story is about. But let's keep going. 32, Esau said, I am about to die. Now, hold on a second. Is there any way that is actually true? Probably not, right? He hasn't been, well, maybe he has. Maybe he's been out for a week foraging and hasn't found anything to eat in a week. And he's coming back. He's dragging himself back home. But come on, you're about to die. Now, I understand when you're hungry, you've missed a meal, you feel maybe like you're going to die, but that's just because you have no awareness of what death actually feels like, right? It's really silly to say that. So Esau says, I am about to die. And then look at this. Of what use is a birthright to me? Because when does a birthright kick in, everybody? When is a birthright important to have? When your dad dies, which theoretically, right, isn't until you're older, right? When you're an adult, when you're a man, you've started your life, your dad is an old man, at some point he dies, that's when it's significant to have a birthright. Up until then, you're just living your life, man. You're just kind of doing your own thing. You know, ask Queen Elizabeth what her life was like before her dad died, right? She probably almost felt like a normal human being. Then her dad dies, and she's thrown right into the middle of being Queen of England all of a sudden, right? It's a big difference. So Jacob shows his personality, right? His personality is, I'm in second place. I want to be in first place. I'm going to do whatever I can to get in first place. Esau also shows his personality. What does he reveal about his personality? He is all about the moment. Right now, my stomach is hungry. I need to fill it. I'm not thinking about the future. I'm not thinking about the long term. I don't care about tomorrow. I don't care about my birthright. That doesn't help me today. All I care about is today. Jacob said, swear to me now. What is Jacob revealing about himself? Is he a trusting soul? Is he just like a nice, trusting guy? Oh, sure, brother, I'll take your word for it. No. He's like, no, you're going to swear to me right now that you're selling me your birthright in exchange for a pot of stew, right? So Esau swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. So far, the storyteller is just telling us what happened, what they said and what happened. Then we come to verse 34. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and he drank and he rose and he went his way. Good news, everybody, Esau didn't actually die. he was able to get a little bit of moisture into his mouth to help him survive until his next meal, right? Basically, he was hungry, he wanted food. And Jacob gave it to him and said, no, we'll just trade your birthright. Now I'm in first place. Yay, right? Now, if you stop there, who does this seem to be an indictment of? Which one of the two brothers? Jacob. It seems to me, and maybe you would see it differently, but the way it's written, or the way I'm inclined to look at it, is that this is a story about how Jacob is a bad guy. Jacob takes advantage of his poor brother. Jacob is the one who's conniving and sneaking. Don't we all sort of have this revulsion for people who are like the used car salesman who cheat other people to get their advantage, right? That like start selling masks for $50 a mask, right when Governor Cuomo says everybody has to wear one when you go out in public, right? I know that's not as simple. You know what I mean, though. Like, it's the people, though, who jack up the prices when demand is high that all of a sudden you start to go, I hate you, and as soon as I don't have to buy from you anymore, I'm not going to, right? So we're inclined already to think Jacob is the villain of this particular narrative. But if we believe that, we're missing the storyteller's point, which is ironic. Take a look at how the storyteller ends. He throws in an editorial comment at the end of this little story to make sure we interpret the story the way he wants us to interpret the story. What is the editorial comment at the end?
Indifferent to the loss of the rights he had thrown away.
Yes, there you go with your Amplified Living Bible again. That's fine. That's fine. It's good. But it says, thus Esau despised his birthright. So this is not a story about how Jacob was a bad person for sneaking his way to the front of the line. This is not one of those stories. Now, it sort of illustrates that. Maybe Jacob's not a great guy, but this is not a story about how Jacob is a bad guy. This is actually a story about how Esau is a bad guy. How Esau doesn't deserve to rule his people if he's going to just care about the moment more than he cares about the future. If he's willing to trade his entire birthright for a pot of lentil stew, not even something tasty, not even something with meat in it, just a bunch of beans and are you kidding me? He would trade something of incredible value for something of small, tiny value. He doesn't deserve to be the leader of the clan. He doesn't deserve to be the one that Isaac puts in charge of the family when he's dead. He just doesn't deserve it. So later on, when Jacob tricks Isaac into giving it to him, we kind of go, yeah, Jacob should have been the guy anyway, but maybe he should have done it differently, right? But remember, you got to remember this too. Isaac is already predetermined to pick Esau. He's already saying, he didn't even consult Rebekah. He didn't consult God. It was just, no, my firstborn, he's the guy that's going to own the family business. Even though his son demonstrates very clearly in this story and in others that he is ill-equipped to be the next chieftain. Jacob is the guy. Jacob knows what he's doing. Jacob is smart. Jacob thinks ahead. Jacob is, yeah. Now, does that take him down a bad road sometimes? And does he start breaking commandments of his own? Absolutely. But who is more qualified to lead the family business and to lead the family? It's not Esau, and that's the point of this story. So do you see how that editorial comment at the end of the story really helps you to understand what the story is about? Honestly, all the stories about Jacob are stories designed to show you that even though he gets in his own way, even though he takes it too far, he really is the son that ought to be the leader of the family. Because remember, Jacob's name gets changed later on to Israel. So this is not just a story about a family. Here's a story of a lovely lady. It's not one of those. It's not one of those. It's a story about the beginning of the nation. And the guy who starts the nation, Jacob, I know it was Abraham, but Jacob specifically starts the 12, and then the 12 we get the 12 tribes. You want to make sure the right guy's in that spot, right? There's this expression in business world and the leadership world that you want to not just make sure you have the right people on the bus, and talking about in your business, you want to make sure you have the right people in the bus, that the right people are a part of your team to get this company where it needs to go. You also want to make sure that the people are sitting in the right seats in the bus, right? You don't want somebody who should be driving the bus hanging out in the back, like all those slackers would do when I would go to school in the bus, in the back, messing with people in the rows in front of you. And some of you are bus drivers, you know what I'm talking about. So you want to put the right people in the right seats of the bus. Jacob, for whatever reason, was born in the second seat. And what his whole story is about is that he should be in the first seat. He's the one God wants there. Now, he does take it to the wrong place to get there, and he is very self-centered for a long time until he wrestles with God all night, if you remember that story. But he's the one that should be there. He's the one that should be leading the family. Make sense? You see how the editorial comment functioned to make sure you get that point? All right, good. Third example is Genesis 13:13. This is actually the one we talked about last week. So if you still have access to last week's notes about Lot, you will remember we even mentioned this in the story. So I'm barely even going to touch on this one. But in Genesis 13, the question, right, is, and we said about this last week, is did Lot make the right decision to move towards the east, towards the Jordan Valley, towards the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? Now, you look at it, the casual reader would look at that and say, oh, of course, he's choosing the best pasture land. He's a herdsman. He's got sheep. They need to eat good grass. That makes perfect sense. Lot, you made a good decision, right? But we pointed out, as we looked at the story last week, that Lot actually made a pretty horrible decision. He made the worst possible decision in that moment. And how do we know that? Partly is because of the going east thing that we talked about. That's the type scenes. But then in verse 13, so if you go to Genesis 13, just a few pages back from where you were. Actually, let me look at verse 12. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. And then we have verse 13. Now, the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Now, the really funny thing is that we don't hear anything else about Lot for a while. Like there's like a pause, and Lot kind of fades into the background for years before he pops back up again at a pretty significant point in the story. But just so that you don't think, as the reader, that Lot made a good decision, he throws that little thing in there as a placeholder to be like, you should expect something bad is going to happen to Lot because of this decision, because he moved as close as he possibly could to people who were exceedingly wicked against the Lord, like on God's hit list. He moved right into the zone of judgment, and he didn't realize it. Like God had a big bullseye surrounding the entire vicinity of Sodom and Gomorrah. And God sets the bullseye, and then sometimes he waits years. Sometimes he waits decades. Sometimes he waits generations to actually bring about the judgment. But these guys have been earning judgment for some time, and Lot, instead of moving away from God's judgment, has actually moved right next door. And eventually he moves in. And eventually, he's actually at the gates as one of the leaders of the city. He made a horrible decision. And the editor, the storyteller, does not want you to take a chance that you might misunderstand the point. And so he says, Lot made a horrible decision. He just comes right out and says it. Any questions? Does that one make sense? All right, let's talk about a controversial one. This is going to be great. All right, turn to 2 Samuel. Turn to 2 Samuel. Chapter 6. 2 Samuel chapter 6. In fact, actually, you don't even need to open up there. If you've got the notes at home, it's actually page 3 of your notes, okay? And again, you can look it up in your own translations, your Living Bibles if you wish. But page 3 is it printed for you if you want to actually look at the text there according to the New American Standard Bible. And at the very least, if you want to follow along with that one, you'll understand what I'm reading and why I'm coming to the conclusions I come to, okay? So here we go, 2 Samuel 6. Now it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God. Now, pause for just a second, because this is where we have to get a little bit of context, all right? Here's a question. Why isn't the ark in Israel in the tabernacle where it's supposed to be. Anybody remember?
Is Saul taken to battle?
Yes. No, not Saul. This actually predates Saul, but it's the right idea. This goes all the way back to the time of the judges. Back to the time of Samuel, little buddy Samuel. Eli was the high priest at the time, right? Eli is the one that told Samuel's mother Hannah that she was going to have a child, and it's wonderful. But Eli was also the priest who refused to discipline his own sons, who were supposed to be the next priests after him. And his sons were like horrible priests, like breaking all the commandments and like cheating the people. And basically, it was like a mafioso organization. I'm not even joking. It was like the mob, except at church. You go to church and you get shaken down for a certain amount of money, or else you don't get your sins forgiven. Like, it's a big deal. And so God says, I'm going to judge these guys, and Eli and his sons are going to get wiped off the map because they haven't been faithful to the calling of being a good priest. I mean, it sort of just makes sense. Well, Israel was going to go fight against the Philistines because the Philistines were threatening them, and they were scared. They didn't think that they could beat the Philistines. So they came up with this genius idea. Let's take the Ark of God into battle with us. Let's treat it like it's a magic box. It's a talisman that if I shake it at the bad guys, they'll get afraid and run away. Or if I shake it and say, God, I'm putting your magic box in danger, then God's going to swoop in with his power and say, whoa, I have to protect the magic box. So I will let you win because you're the one that is protecting the magic box. Okay? Now, if you've seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you're already predisposed to thinking of the Ark as a magic box, right? Because it opens up and that's when everybody's faces melt and it's scary, right? Sorry, spoiler alert. If you haven't seen the Raiders of the Lost Ark at this point, I don't know what to tell you. I can't hold on to a secret for 30 years. I'm sorry. I just can't do it. So anyway, they treat the Ark of the Lord, which is a place where God is to meet with his people to forgive them for their sins. It's supposed to be inside a tent, inside behind several curtains in this private alone place where nobody can even see it except the high priest once a year to forgive the sins of the people for that year. And they march it out like it's a magic box into battle to try to manipulate God into giving them the victory. Well, God's not playing by those rules. So, oh, fine, you want to treat my Ark of the Covenant with disrespect? Let's let the enemy win. He allows the Philistines to wipe them out and then capture the Ark of the Covenant. Capture it. Take it away with them as a spoil of war. This is crazy. This is remarkable. This is like the national, it would be like the equivalent, and it's not even close to this, but it's like, this is, what I'm about to say to you is about 1/10 as close as what they experienced. If somebody came onto American soil and somehow was able to take the Statue of Liberty, throw it onto a boat, take it back to their country, and put it up under a statue of, say, their dictator, and have the statue of the dictator like crushing down the poor Statue of Liberty. That's the equivalent of what has happened in this story. It is a national disgrace. It is horrible. All because people treated God's holy things like they were magic boxes that they could manipulate God with. God's not into that. But here's the crazy thing. The Philistines take it back, planning to show how superior their gods are to the gods of the Israelites they just defeated. So they put it in the temple of their God, and there's this big statue of their God, right? And then there's the little tiny Ark of the Covenant. It's not big, it's just a little box, on poles. They put it down next to it, sort of like at its feet, right? And they come back the next day, like they go home or whatever, and they come back the next morning, and the big tall statue of their God is lying on its face in front of the Ark of the Covenant with the neck and the hands broken off. Now, I'm pretty sure that no Philistines vandalized the temple during the night. What is the storyteller trying to get across? God made sure that no pagan king or no pagan god was going to get the glory over his presence. And so God made sure that it was obvious to the Philistines, you may have captured this holy item, but you have not beaten the God of Israel. In fact, your gods are at his feet with their neck and their hands broken. They can do nothing against him. So they move it to a different temple, and the same thing happens. They move him to a different city of Philistia, and all of a sudden a plague breaks out on the people for having it. And the Philistines are like, if we hold on to this magic box, we're going to be destroyed by the God of the box. And so they send it back. It would be like if they captured the Statue of Liberty to make fun of America, and it caused so much trouble in their own country, they put it back on a box with an apology note saying, I'm really, really, really sorry. Sorry. You can have it back. Please take it back. So they send the ark of the Lord back, but the ark never makes it as far as the tabernacle. And that's a story for another day. The ark was... I'll just say it now because I've got a couple minutes. So there was a very specific way you were supposed to transport the Ark of the Covenant, okay? It's a box, and it had these rings, and then you would slide these really long poles through the rings, and then 4 guys would carry it. They would cover it up first, like they would put all kinds of these fancy coverings around it to shield it so that people couldn't look on it, so they just see basically a wrapped item. And they'd have these long poles, and then 4 guys would carry it from place to place, and they'd set it down, they'd put it, and they would basically build the tabernacle around it. They would set it down, and then they would build a tabernacle around it, and somebody was authorized to pull off the coverings, and then boom, it's there in that sacred place for the next time the high priest needs to meet with God to forgive the sins of the people. So they decided not to carry it to the way God told them to carry it. They decided to put it on an ox cart and transport it that way, which is silly because God had given them completely explicit directions on how to do this. And the Bible says that as the ox cart was going, because roads are not a thing in the ancient world, the ox cart is going, it bumps, and the ark starts to slide out of the ox cart to fall on the ground. Like, this is worse than letting the American flag touch the ground. You know how disrespectful that sort of is in the lore of flags and army and all that stuff? This is worse than that. This would be like throwing if the ark falls off a cart and lands in the mud, it would be like the flag touching the ground, falling on the ground, and then people stepping on it, just tromping it into the mud. That's the equivalent of the insult that would be. So one of the people traveling with the ark does what anybody would do. He reaches out his hand to stop the ark from falling off. And he probably thought God was going to say, thanks, buddy. Appreciate you looking after my magic box. And instead, God strikes him dead in an instant for having the audacity to touch a holy thing that God had given to his people. He gets struck dead for doing God a favor. But the point is that the people who made the mistake were the people who loaded it in an ox cart in the first place instead of following God's instructions. And when it comes to the holy things in the tabernacle, God doesn't play. He's not playing. It's not a game. It has to be done to the letter, or else bad things happen. So anyway, the ark never makes it all the way to the tabernacle because the guy got struck dead on the road, and David gets super mad. And I don't know why David gets super mad, but David gets super mad about it, and he's like, fine, I'm not going to take the ark to the tabernacle. And he goes off back to Jerusalem, and time goes by. And the ark is left at the house of this guy named Obed-Edom. And while it's there, he apparently treats it with respect. He apparently gives it the appropriate gravitas that it deserves, and the text says that the Lord blesses his house for the way he takes care of the ark of God. Like, this is pretty cool. Like, somebody's like, you know what, David, don't worry, I'll take it under control, I'll take care of this until it's time for you to take it to the tabernacle. So David gets word finally, I don't know, years later, months later, weeks later, he gets word that God is blessing the house of this guy, and that God isn't really angry. God just didn't want his ark to be touched inappropriately or transported inappropriately. And so then, verse 12, David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. David's like, yay, we can bring the ark back to the tabernacle. This is great. and he takes it back into Jerusalem. And so it was, verse 13, that when the bearers of the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. Now, hold on a second. First of all, they're actually carrying it on the poles again, which is the way they were supposed to in the first place. So David seems to be learning from the mistakes he made earlier. So they're carrying it. They walk 6 steps, and they stop. And what does David do? Nope, not yet. He gets to the dancing in a minute. He sacrifices an ox. Not like a little lamb, not like a little bird, not like a little tiny thing. An ox. How many paces does it take to get from Obed-Edom's house to Jerusalem? Even if it's a couple of miles. 6 steps, you stop and you sacrifice an ox. David is sacrificing to God like crazy. Now, the idea there for us is to realize that David is being super, super over the top in a good way with his love and his worship for God. He's like, God, you've asked me to bring one sacrifice for certain circumstances. I'm so excited about bringing the ark back to Jerusalem, back to the tabernacle. I'm going to stop every 6 steps, and I'm going to offer you a new offering, a new gift. And every 6 steps, boom, 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 he is continuing to send up praise after praise after praise after praise to God through these sacrifices. This is kind of a big deal. What I'm trying to show you is David is hyped, okay? He is jacked up. He is, like, his adrenaline is pumping in his ears. Verse 14, and this is where it gets interesting for us Baptists. And David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. Now, some of us who are Baptists are more comfortable with waltzing, right? Waltzing is very dignified. It's very like, it's almost geometric, right? It's almost like we've taken dancing, we've subtracted emotion, and what we're left with is nice, graceful, elegant movements. We can watch Jane Austen movies and it doesn't bother us, okay? That doesn't seem to be what David is doing here. David is dancing with all of his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. He's not wearing his kingly outfit. He's just wearing a linen robe of some kind, okay? So David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of the trumpet, okay? This is a lot more like going to a college football game than it is what we think of as church, right? We think of church as very dignified, very reserved, kind of keep yourselves in place, sing the songs, focus on the words, the emotion doesn't matter. We're all about the ideas that this song is trying to communicate to us. Now, I know I'm oversimplifying, but that's because maybe that's just the kind of churches I grew up in, okay? David is doing something very different. There's shouting, there is the sound of the trumpet, there is wild, all might dancing happening. Verse 16, this is where it gets interesting. Then it happened, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, that Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Now, we'll come back to Michal in a minute, but who is Michal? Michal, believe it or not, is David's very first wife. The first wife he ever had. Saul, when he was working for Saul, he kind of killed 400 Philistines, brought evidence that he killed 400 Philistines. Saul let him marry his daughter. It's kind of like he steps up in power and authority within the country, and now he's got Michal. And apparently Michal was on board with this. It wasn't like she was forced to be married to David, but it's a long story. David then gets sent off into exile, right? And so Michal remarries some other dude. Saul gives her to somebody else. And when David becomes king, he comes and he forcibly takes her back. He's like, she was mine to begin with. I'm keeping Michal. It's so funny. Her second husband literally is following behind her, weeping and crying. And David's like, get out of here, buddy. Your time is over. And he takes Michal back. And so Michal has been living in Jerusalem with David for X amount of time. And as you can probably tell, over the years, her heart has distanced itself from David. And it sort of just makes sense. David abandoned her, ran away into the wilderness. She stayed behind, was given to somebody else. She seemed to have sort of settled into that life. David forcibly rips her away and says, no, you're coming back to live with me. She's apparently not happy about it. She sees David dancing like a fool in front of this procession leading the ark of the Lord back to the temple, and she despises him in her heart. And then verse 17, okay, let me just read this quickly. So they brought in the ark of the Lord, they set it in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it, and David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. Okay, he's excited. He's using the worship practices of the day to show God he's excited. When David had finished offering the burnt offering and the peace offering, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Further, he distributed to all the people, to all the multitude of Israel, both to men and women, a cake of bread and one of dates and one of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed each to his house. So he's feeding everybody. He's being the generous giver. You know, kings are usually takers, and David is being this generous giver. He's giving away all the sacrifices. His own personal wealth doesn't matter. What matters is bringing God, his presence, into the tabernacle, into the tent, in his home. David is on top of the world. And then he goes home. Verse 20. But when David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, and these are the only words I think she ever says in the Bible, "How the king of Israel distinguished himself today. He uncovered himself today in the eyes of his servants' maids, as one of the foolish ones shamelessly uncovers himself." So what is her accusation to David? David, you acted like a complete idiot. You were undignified, unking-like. That is not how kings are supposed to behave. Yes, you can get excited. Yes, you can feel emotions, but don't show it. Don't be wild. Don't start running around and dancing and leaping around and doing whatever dance moves David was doing. And she's especially embarrassed that he's not looking like a king. He's not dressing like a king. He's probably dressed very humbly, maybe like a servant would be. Just a linen ephod, it says, like a linen cloak he's wearing. And he's jumping around and dancing. And she's like, "Oh, you're practically naked, running around and jumping in front of all these people. They must think you're a joke. You're a king. You're supposed to be dignified." Now, how does she know this? She knows this because her dad used to be the king, and that's not how her dad acted. So I think we're going to leave it for there, and then next week we're going to come back, and we're going to see how David responds to her, and then we're going to look at the editorial comment and try to figure out which person God agrees with. Love you. See you next week. Bye-bye.